January 17th, 1940. The Weapons Testing Range, Fort Benning, Georgia. The morning air smelled of gun oil and wet pine. Frost clung to the edges of sandbag walls as ordnance officers gathered in a semicircle around a makeshift trench system, clipboards in hand, breath visible in the cold. Before them stood a wiry farm boy from Oklahoma, barely 22 years old, his hands scarred from years of working combines and barbed wire fences. His name was Private First Class Vernon Hawkins. In his grip was something the Army had never seen before, a standard-issue M1903 Springfield rifle, but attached beneath its barrel was a modified steel pitchfork head, sharpened to surgical precision, welded at an angle that allowed both stabbing and slashing in confined spaces. The officers stared. Some smirked. One scratched notes with visible skepticism. Vernon had submitted the design 3 times. 3 times it had been rejected. The words in the rejection letters were clinical, non-standard modification, structural integrity concerns, incompatible with bayonet regulations. But Vernon wasn't an engineer. He was a farmer's son who understood leverage, angles, and what happens when you need to clear a barn of feral hogs in the dark. He had built this weapon because he believed in his gut that the trenches of Europe would not be won with textbook tactics. They would be won in the mud, in the dark, in spaces too narrow for rifles and too desperate for hesitation. The demonstration lasted 11 minutes. Vernon moved through the trench simulation with mechanical efficiency, driving the pitchfork mount into sandbag dummies, twisting, retracting, firing, advancing. The weapon functioned without jamming. The mount did not bend. When he finished, the officers exchanged glances. Then came the paperwork. The device was classified as unapproved field modification. Vernon was issued a formal reprimand for unauthorized weapon alteration. The Pitchfork Bayonet Mount was banned from official use, its blueprints filed away in a basement archive at the Ordnance Department. The Army had spoken. Innovation, it seemed, was not welcome when it came with dirt under its fingernails. But wars do not care about paperwork. The United States military in 1940 was an institution built on the doctrine of industrial firepower and disciplined formations. The lessons of the First World War had been absorbed into training manuals, staff college curricula, and the minds of officers who had survived the Meuse Argonne and the Somme. The bayonet, in official doctrine, was a psychological weapon, a tool to break enemy morale during the final yards of an assault, a symbol of aggression more than a practical instrument of killing. The M1905 bayonet, 16 inches of straight steel, was designed to be attached to the Springfield rifle in a single, standardized configuration. It was a weapon of discipline, of uniformity, of predictable performance in predictable conditions. There was no room in the manual for improvisation. There was no chapter on what to do when the predictable collapsed into chaos. The German Wehrmacht, by contrast, had spent the interwar years refining a different kind of warfare. Blitzkrieg was not merely about tanks and dive bombers. It was about speed, disorientation, and the willingness to close distance faster than the enemy could react. German infantry were trained in close quarters battle, in the art of the grenade and the submachine gun, in the brutal efficiency of room clearing and trench fighting. They expected their enemies to fight at range, to rely on artillery and defensive positions. They did not expect men like Vernon Hawkins. In the winter of 1940, as Europe burned and America watched, The farm boys and factory workers, who would become the backbone of the U.S. Army, were still learning how to march in step. Most had never fired a rifle before basic training. Most had never seen the ocean, let alone imagined what it would be like to storm a beach under machine gun fire. The Pitchfork Bayonet Mount, tucked away in some forgotten filing cabinet, was a footnote, a curiosity, a violation of regulations, until it wasn't. Operation Torch brought American soldiers into combat for the first time in the European theater, and the learning curve was written in casualties. The landings at Oran and Casablanca were chaotic. Landing craft stuck on sandbars, radios waterlogged, units scattered across miles of unfamiliar coastline. Within days, American forces were pushing inland, colliding with German and Italian positions in the rocky hills and dry riverbeds of Algeria. The terrain was unforgiving. The Germans were not. Private First Class Vernon Hawkins had been deployed with the 1st Infantry Division, assigned to a rifle company tasked with clearing fortified positions in the town of Medjez, el-Bab. The Pitchfork Bayonet Mount had traveled with him, hidden in his pack, against regulations, against orders, against every piece of advice his sergeants had given him. He had re-welded it twice, reinforced the mounting bracket, sharpened the tines until they could puncture canvas with a whisper of pressure. He did not talk about it. He did not show it off. He simply carried it, the way a man carries a lucky coin or a photograph of home, something that might not make sense to anyone else, but felt necessary. The town was a maze of stone buildings and narrow alleyways, the kind of place where sight lines collapsed into arm's reach, and every doorway could hide a machine gun nest. The company moved slowly, clearing structures one at a time, using grenades and shotguns and bayonets when the fighting spilled into rooms too small for rifles. Vernon's squad was tasked with securing a 2-story administrative building that German forces had converted into a strong point. Intelligence suggested a handful of defenders. Intelligence was wrong. The first floor was abandoned. Shell casings littered the floor. The smell of cordite and old sweat hung in the air. Vernon and 3 others moved up the staircase, rifles ready, breathing shallow. At the top of the stairs was a hallway, maybe 15 feet long, with doors on either side. The sergeant signaled for Vernon to take the left. He nodded, attached the Pitchfork mount to his rifle in 3 practiced motions, and moved forward. The door exploded outward, not from a grenade, from a man. A German soldier, maybe 19, wild-eyed and screaming, lunged with a trench knife. Vernon's rifle was at low ready. The Pitchfork mount caught the soldier in the sternum, drove upward through the rib cage, and the man's scream turned into a wet gasp. Vernon twisted, pulled, fired a round into the doorway behind the body, and kept moving. There was no time to think, no time to register what had just happened. The hallway was suddenly full of noise, shouts in German, the crack of pistol rounds, the thud of boots on wood. Another soldier emerged from the right side door. Vernon pivoted, slashed with the mount, felt it connect with something soft, then drove the rifle butt into the man's face. The German dropped. A 3rd soldier appeared at the end of the hall, submachine gun raised. Vernon lunged forward, closing the distance before the man could fire, and drove the Pitchfork mount through the gap between the soldier's helmet and collar. The German collapsed. The entire engagement lasted maybe 12 seconds. When the hallway went silent, Vernon stood there, breathing hard, blood on his hands, the Pitchfork mount dripping. His sergeant stared at him from the staircase, mouth open. "What the hell is that thing?" Vernon didn't answer. He wiped the blood on his trousers and kept moving. By the time the building was cleared, 5 German soldiers were dead in that hallway. 3 of them had been killed by the Pitchfork Bayonet Mount. The other 2 had been shot by Vernon's squad mates, but only after Vernon had broken the German defensive position with a weapon the Army had banned 2 years earlier. The after-action report mentioned close-quarters combat and effective use of improvised tools. It did not mention the pitchfork. It did not mention that Vernon had violated standing orders by modifying his rifle. It did not mention that the weapon the Army had rejected had just saved American lives. But the soldiers noticed. Word spread. By the time the division regrouped outside Medjez el-Bab, 6 men had approached Vernon, asking to see the mount, asking how it worked, asking if he could make more. He couldn't. He didn't have the tools. But the idea had been planted. Somewhere in the minds of men who had seen what close-quarters combat actually looked like, the regulations began to seem less important than survival. The German soldiers who fought in North Africa had been trained to believe in the superiority of their doctrine. They had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union with a speed that shocked the world. Their tactics relied on coordination, on the integration of armor and infantry, on the assumption that their enemies would fight predictably, at range, from fixed positions, with hesitation born of inexperience. They respected the British for their tenacity. They were curious about the Americans, these newcomers, who arrived with endless supplies and uncertain skills. The German infantrymen expected the American soldier to be brave, perhaps, but soft, untested, reliant on equipment rather than instinct, unused to the brutal intimacy of close combat. What they did not expect was improvisation. What they did not expect was a farm boy from Oklahoma who had turned a piece of agricultural equipment into a weapon of war, who had studied the problem of confined spaces and solved it with steel and stubbornness. The German soldier in that hallway, the one who lunged with a trench knife, expected his enemy to hesitate, to fumble with a rifle too long for the space, to give him the half-second he needed to close the distance and kill. He did not expect to die on the end of a pitchfork, welded to a rifle, driven by a man who had spent his childhood slaughtering hogs and understood exactly how much force it took to puncture flesh and bone. This was not the war the Germans had been promised. This was not the enemy they had been taught to despise. This was something else, something adaptable, something dangerous, something that learned fast and cared nothing for the way things were supposed to be done. In the months that followed Medjez el-Bab, the Pitchfork Bayonet Mount remained officially banned. Vernon Hawkins was never decorated for his actions in that hallway. There was no ceremony, no mention in dispatches, no acknowledgement from the officers who had once smirked at his demonstration back at Fort Benning. But among the infantrymen who fought house to house in Tunisia, Sicily, and later in Italy, stories circulated. Stories about a weapon that shouldn't exist, wielded by a man who shouldn't have survived, in a fight that shouldn't have been won. The stories were embellished, compressed, mythologized. Some said the mount was made from a captured German bayonet. Some said Vernon had killed a dozen men with it. Some said the army had tried to court-martial him and failed. None of these things were true. But the essence of the story, The image of a banned weapon saving American lives resonated because it spoke to a deeper truth about the American soldier in World War II. The men who stormed Omaha Beach, who fought through the Hurtgen Forest, who island hopped across the Pacific, were not professional warriors. They were citizens, pulled from farms and factories, given uniforms and rifles, and 6 months of training, and told to defeat enemies who had spent years perfecting the craft of war. They were not supposed to win by being better soldiers. They were supposed to win by being more adaptable, more resourceful, more willing to break the rules when the rules didn't work. The Pitchfork Bayonet Mount was a symbol of that ethos, an object that existed because someone had looked at the official solution and said, "That's not good enough." The German soldiers who died in that hallway in Medjez el-Bab were professionals. They had trained for years. They knew their doctrine. They trusted their equipment. But they died because they encountered something their training hadn't prepared them for. An enemy who refused to fight the way he was supposed to, who improvised, who adapted, who turned a farming tool into an instrument of war because survival mattered more than regulations. The pitchfork is an ancient tool. It appears in medieval manuscripts, in Renaissance paintings, in the hands of peasants and revolutionaries and farmers across centuries. It is a tool of labor, of harvest, of the turning of earth, and the gathering of grain. It is also a weapon, crude, ungainly, but effective in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. In American iconography, the pitchfork carries a dual meaning. It is a symbol of rural simplicity, of honest work, of connection to the land. It is also a symbol of rebellion, of the common man rising against authority, of improvisation in the face of oppression. Vernon Hawkins's Pitchfork Bayonet Mount was both of these things. It was a tool of labor, transformed into a tool of war. It was a rejection of the official doctrine, a statement that the men who fought the war understood their circumstances better than the men who wrote the manuals. It was a piece of American abundance, not in the sense of wealth or resources, but in the sense of creativity, of the willingness to take what was available and make it into something new. The Germans had superior training, superior tactics, superior experience, but they did not have the cultural flexibility to imagine that a pitchfork could become a bayonet, that a farm boy could outthink an ordnance department, that the rules could be ignored when the rules got people killed. This was the asymmetry at the heart of the American war effort. The United States did not win World War II because its soldiers were better trained or more experienced than their enemies. It won because its soldiers were willing to improvise, to adapt, to discard what didn't work, and embrace what did, even when, especially when, what worked violated every regulation in the book. The Pitchfork Bayonet Mount was never mass-produced. It was never officially approved. It was never issued to troops as standard equipment. But it didn't need to be. Its existence, its use in that hallway, its presence in the stories soldiers told each other, was enough. It was proof that the American soldier was not bound by the limitations of his training, that he could look at a problem and solve it in ways his enemies could not predict. After the fall of Tunisia in May 1943, German officers conducted extensive debriefings with soldiers who had fought against American forces. The reports, filed in Berlin and later recovered by Allied intelligence, contain recurring themes. The Americans were aggressive in close combat. They adapted quickly to local conditions. They employed non-standard weapons and tactics. One report, filed by an Oberleutnant who had commanded a grenadier company near Medjez el-Bab, includes a single bewildering sentence. Enemy infantry observed using agricultural implements as bayonet attachments. Origin and purpose unclear. The report was annotated by a staff officer in Berlin with a single word: verify. It was never verified. The war moved too quickly, the paperwork was lost, and the officer who wrote the report was killed 3 months later in Sicily. But the confusion, the sense that the Americans were fighting in ways that defied categorization, lingered. German soldiers began to speak of the American infantryman with a mixture of respect and frustration. He was not as disciplined as the British. He was not as fanatical as the Soviet. But he was dangerous in ways that were hard to quantify. Dangerous because he refused to fight the way wars were supposed to be fought. This was the transformation the Germans had not anticipated. They had expected the Americans to be wealthy, well supplied, but ultimately soft, too comfortable, too accustomed to abundance, to endure the grinding brutality of infantry combat. What they encountered instead was a different kind of abundance, an abundance of creativity, of adaptability, of the willingness to reject doctrine when doctrine failed. The Pitchfork Bayonet Mount was not mentioned in German intelligence assessments. It was too small, too specific, too strange. But the mindset that created it, the refusal to accept official answers as final, the willingness to build solutions from scratch, that mindset terrified the Germans more than any weapon ever could. Vernon Hawkins survived the war. He returned to Oklahoma in the winter of 1945, 40 pounds lighter, with scars on his hands and a Purple Heart he never wore. He went back to farming. He married, had 3 children, and never spoke about the hallway in Medjez el-Bab. When his grandchildren asked about the war, he told them stories about the food, the weather, the friends he made. He never mentioned the Pitchfork Bayonet Mount. It had been lost somewhere in Italy, left behind when his rifle was replaced, buried in the mud and rubble of a continent that had tried to kill him. The Army never asked about it. The officers who had banned it in 1940 were promoted, retired, forgotten. The paperwork was destroyed in a file purge in the 1950s. The weapon itself ceased to exist, except in the memories of a handful of old soldiers who sometimes, late at night, after too many drinks, would tell a story about a farm boy with a pitchfork who killed 5 Germans in a hallway too narrow for regulations. But the idea survived. It survived in the doctrine manuals that years later began to include sections on field modifications and adaptive tactics. It survived in the training programs that taught soldiers to think creatively, to solve problems with the tools at hand, to reject the assumption that the official way was the only way. It survived in the culture of the American military, a culture that, at its best, valued results over protocol, ingenuity over obedience, survival over appearances. The Pitchfork Bayonet Mount was never vindicated. It was never celebrated. But it was never forgotten either. It lived on as a ghost in the machine, a reminder that wars are not won by the men who write the manuals, but by the men who ignore them when the manuals fail. And it lived on in a deeper truth, one that the Germans learned too late. that the American soldier was not defined by his equipment or his training, but by his willingness to adapt, to improvise, to take a piece of farm equipment and turn it into a weapon, to look at a problem the army couldn't solve and solve it himself, in the dark, in the mud, in a hallway that smelled of blood and cordite and the collapse of certainty. Freedom, it turns out, is not just the absence of tyranny. It is the presence of possibility. The possibility that a farm boy can outthink a general, that a pitchfork can become a bayonet, that the rules can be broken when breaking them saves lives. The Germans came to that hallway expecting discipline. What they found instead was improvisation, and they died because of it. Vernon Hawkins never knew he had taught them that lesson. He never knew his weapon had become a story, a symbol, a piece of American mythology. He only knew that when the moment came, when the regulations failed and the doctrine collapsed and the enemy was too close for hesitation, he had a tool that worked, a tool he had built himself, a tool the army had banned, a tool that killed 5 Germans and saved his life, and proved, in the smallest and most final way possible, that the war would not be won by the men who followed orders, but by the men who knew when to ignore them. The frost still clings to the sandbags at Fort Benning. The reports still gather dust in the archives. But somewhere, in the memory of soldiers who are now grandfathers, in the stories told around fires and in barrooms, the Pitchfork Bayonet Mount still exists, forbidden, unrecognized, and utterly American.